Healing is a strategic advisory firm that works in advertising, marketing, technology. We're lucky to have a couple of major clients in the podcast space on our roster, such as iHeart, Wondery, and NPR, and Fox. Welcome to the post-lunch lull. How are you feeling after lunch?
We cleared this room out.
Good. So we have an illustrious panel here today. It's a great moment in time. I heard audio revolution, audio boom. Podcasting is obviously a big part of that. So without further ado, let's meet our illustrious panelists, starting at the end. So if you could tell us a little bit about the company we work for, its place in the ecosystem, and what you're all about.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Dave Zorab. I'm the co-founder. Hello, everyone. My name is Dave Zorab. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Chartable.com. We are a podcast measurement company. We help publishers and creators understand their audiences and market their shows, and we help advertisers understand the value of the money they spend on podcast ads.
Hey everyone, Ryan Rose. I head our podcast division. We have Digital Audio Exchange, DAX for short. We're a unique business model where our primary business was streaming rep firms, so we represent a lot of digital audio publishers, whether that's music, news, or sports. A lot of them are the non-Pandora, Spotifys of the world, and we created a podcast division to allow for podcast line items to get onto a media plan with streaming so that advertisers, typically traditional advertisers, could get into the podcasting space at a much more efficient rate.
Cool. Hey everybody, my name is Kelly Garner. I'm the founder and CEO of Treefort. We are a podcast company focusing on narrative, story-driven content. I came out of television for the last 15 years. I was started in documentaries, then moved into unscripted/reality TV, and finished up working as a network executive for Sci-Fi and the studio at NBC Universal. And I'm very, very excited to be talking podcasts because this is consuming all of us, and it's exciting to be in an area where there's massive growth as opposed to attrition, which we were seeing with all the cable networks. So it's really fun to be here.
Hi, my name's Tim Street. I work at a company called Authentic. Our parent company is Podtrac. Podtrac does measurement for podcasts, and you can see what the top podcasts are getting if you go there. My job at Authentic is connecting podcasters with sponsorship deals. So I'm like a talent scout. I'm looking for creators, celebrities, YouTubers, podcasters. I'm looking for folks that want to monetize through sponsorships.
Hi, I'm Corey Kalesa. I'm with Art19. Art19 is an enterprise hosting and dynamic ad insertion technology company for podcasts. So think about hosting podcasts, distributing them to players, ad serving technology. And then earlier this year, we launched a monetization layer, a subsidiary called Art19 Media, where we can offer the full suite of ad products. So that's direct host-read ads, that's targeted ads, as well as content creation.
Great, so welcome to everybody who's watching us by webcast now and in the future. And we want to get to know you guys a little bit in the audience. So if you just raise your hand, how many of you would consider yourself to be like podcast talent or creators or producers? Quite a few of you, for those not being able to see the hands on the webcast. How many of you are in like selling podcast mode? Great, several people here. How about media buyers, planners, agencies, brands? 2 hands. And then publishers? Great, probably. Great, thank you. That helps us. Maybe we'll try to tailor our answers to the audience, so thanks for that. So, audience is experiencing, renaissance right now. It's a watershed moment, and podcasting is a big part of that. And we were lucky to have 2 of the authors of an interactive advertising bureau report that just came out last week on our panel, Dave and Ryan. So I'm going to ask you guys, Buzz, what do you think is driving this audio boom, and what is podcasting role in that?
Well, there's a zillion things driving the audio boom. I feel like we could get a panel bingo card going for all the different keywords that you've probably already heard and will hear on this panel. We can talk about the intimacy of the medium. We can talk about Serial. We can talk about the iOS bundling the podcast app into the phone. These are all really important events, but really, I think that we're seeing an amazing explosion of content, both in quality and quantity. During this panel, there will be 20 new podcasts started and submitted to Apple Podcasts. That's totally insane. And that's great. On top of that, there's also so many amazing shows being created, both scripted and unscripted, news, entertainment, storytelling, all kinds of shows for all kinds of folks. And we've seen an explosion in technology, both on the platform side and on the player side, technology serving publishers, technology serving advertisers. And I think that advertisers are also getting super excited about this medium, which is great if you're a creator and you're building something that's ad-supported. We want advertisers to feel good about the money they spend on podcasts because that's what pays the creators to keep creating the shows that we love.
I also think there's a lot of clutter in the space, so we're becoming inundated with more and more media everywhere. So audio serves as a really good channel for you to be able to tune into something specific. So that's why podcasting is amazing, because you have the ability to opt in into what you want to listen to, right? So there's tons of media that's being thrown at you that you possibly don't want to see, or it's not targeted towards you. Podcasting in particular, that's your choice. You get to choose what you want to listen to, and it's likely going to be content that you're going to resonate with.
You know, podcasting all starts with people like yourselves, the creators, and we're lucky to have, you know, a creator on the dais here, a very early adopter of podcasting. Tim's been in the podcast space since 2005, so you're always thinking about the creators front and center. So when you're out scouting talent, what kind of conversations do you have with creators about monetization?
So I'm looking for some specific things. I'm looking for existing shows that are getting at least 10,000 unique downloads per episode or more. And that's measured by Podtrac is what we're looking for when I say 10,000 unique downloads. I'm also looking for shows that have some type of passion behind them. I mean, right now, if you're a woman in podcasting, it's a pretty magical time. And if you're not a woman and you're in podcasting, it's still a magical time. Right now, the gate's still open. The door is there for you to create the thing that you want to be known for the rest of your life. That moment is here. And you laugh. You laugh. But it's true. You see the people out there that are building brands, and they're monetizing not only through podcasting, but they're monetizing through books, through TV deals, through movie deals. It's still happening. How long that window's open? I don't know. It used to be open in television. It used to exist. It closed. Now's the time.
Very inspirational. So you know, the talent is known for, like, the host-read, ads are among the most popular parts of monetization on podcasts. When you're having conversations with talent to join the Authentic fold, do people ask you about, do I have to read certain types of ads, or what's that process like when you have those conversations?
Well, I think some other folks can jump in on this, but having the person that you feel like you have a relationship with, they're inside your head, they're inside your ear, having them talk about a product or a service and talk about that experience, the ROI on that is huge. So maybe you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, I would love to, and I'm going to say a bunch of the bingo keywords, so be ready. Yeah, I would say that that host-read ad format is incredibly performant. It is really authentic, which is one of the words. It's built into the storytelling and to the conversation in a way that other ads, aren't, right? It's someone that's got a relationship with their audience and speaking about a product or service and talking about it sometimes in a personal experience kind of way. So it really does drive results. It is, that host-read ad is the format that built the space. It is, what we started with in podcasting. It is what direct response advertisers came in to test and proved that it worked. And that was what drew the attention of larger brand advertisers that then saw, okay, there's a there. Like all these performance-based advertisers keep returning season after season because they're getting positive ROI. And so really I would say that the host-read ad is what proved out the medium in terms of performance, in terms of monetization. It is, I would say, a good chunk of that is just that host integration. I think another piece of it is something you guys were speaking to earlier. It's an on-demand format, so the engagement's really high. If you're choosing to listen to a program, you're paying attention, and we've seen that drive incredible results for the ads as well. It's also a really intimate medium, which is another bingo word, but it truly is an intimate experience. The way you pay attention to the content, that also impacts ad effectiveness. So I would say, the host-read ad is it's not going anywhere. I don't think it should. If I can add, I think that it's not for everyone. And what I mean by that is I'm sure there's some talent you work with. We work with journalists as an example where host-read ad, it's not appropriate, right, for their line of work. It crosses a line. And we need other ways to monetize. And some of those ways are in targeted ad products as a complement to a host-read ad. It gives publishers and content creators ways to monetize that are not just host-read only. So I'm excited about that development as kind of the space is shifting, the ad monetization space is shifting. At Art19, we've got a targeted ad product that allows marketers to buy ads based on who the listener is. They're pre-recorded, so they don't have to be voiced by talent. And some marketers want that. They don't necessarily want their brand message, delivered by a host, someone that's not in their fold. So I think just the way that the ad space is evolving and having more options in addition to host-read is a really great thing. It gives marketers a lot more moves. It gives publishers more moves. It makes more money for the space. And as you were saying earlier, the content follows where the money is, and that really, it's going to help all of us on all sides. So, I'm happy the host-read ads really kind of prove the medium, and that we're seeing a really, exciting evolution towards, I'd say, more digital ads and performance in that way.
I just want to follow up on that point as well. And I think it's really exciting that so many advertisers are getting into the space. But just to follow up on the point you made about sort of journalists and reading ads, clearly that's not good for anybody to have that happen. What I'm looking forward to is, when will there be more advertisers coming in to be sort of a presenting or a foundational sponsor so that they can present it but not break up the content? In our first sort of big series that we launched last summer, it was called Fatal Voyage, The Mysterious Death of Natalie Wood. We launched it within 2 days. It went to the top of Apple Podcasts, and we ended up with over 10 million listeners, which was amazing. And we were really kind of shocked that it resonated to the degree that it did. That said, when we had sort of host-read ads come in, given the content, given this was a really horrific sort of crime, it was an active investigation, we've got interviews with police and people who were there and all of this stuff. But when an ad comes in for whatever it is, and God bless every advertiser, we're happy to have them. But I'm excited to see how this evolves, and I'm hopeful that more projects like The Message from GE, which I've heard referenced several times. I keep wondering, it had 6 million or 10 million listeners. When are we going to be seeing more of those kind of plays? And I think that's really powerful when you're not necessarily selling something specific, but there's sort of that brand connection to the content, but it's a light touch.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people worry when they see these new kinds of ad products come into the market. Creators worry and commentators in the industry worry that it's going to somehow devalue the medium in some way by introducing new ways to buy, potentially programmatic ways to buy, where it's not just the host-read ad. And we've done at Chartable ad attribution studies with lots of different brands across millions and millions of ad impressions, some targeted, some baked in. And in almost every case, the advertisers are so happy that it's working way better than they ever thought it would. It's working better than the coupon codes say it would. It's working better than the vanity URLs say it would. This medium is actually undervalued right now for great creators. And so we see, from where we sit as a technology provider to this industry, incredible upside for creators in experimenting with these different formats and new technologies. Because advertisers are going to see the value, they're going to come back and buy more. And that's going to be great for a lot of the folks in this room.
I think there's also a lot of concern in the industry that we're in this bubble, we're heading towards a certain imbalance. And I think what's important to note is whether it's dynamic, whether it's embedded, whether it's host-read, whether it's pre-recorded, whether it's manually a managed service, or whether it's programmatic, I think as long as there's a balance, or at least we're conscious of the fact that there might be an imbalance, as long as we're aware that those are the ingredients that could shift the industry to what we don't want it to go to, I think that's a good step. So we just need to make sure that right now I think we're in a good place where we have this balance of pre-recorded, where it's just like the typical radio ad, and host reads. But if we keep going into a certain path of more programmatic, pre-recorded, then we're going to start to disconnect to what really resonates with podcast audiences, right? So I think that balance is something to keep. It's just important to keep in mind.
I'll definitely agree with that. When you get into programmatic ads, you can definitely streamline things and commoditize the space, and the CPMs will drop dramatically. You saw it happen in web video. And the same thing, I think, can happen in podcasting. I mean, the CPMs are way, way higher for a host-read ad than they are for a dynamically inserted ad. So, be careful about that if you are a creator. Do your homework, figure out what's best for you. If you are a journalist and you're worried about the host-read ad where the CPMs are higher, there are workarounds. You can have a producer do the ad read, but they need to be part of the show. So there are different ways of approaching it. Just do your homework.
Do people think that we're in a bubble, a podcast bubble? Ryan mentioned that. Do people feel that?
I do not feel that way. I feel like this is the very tip of the glacier that's coming. There's, a million podcasts, sure, but there are not breakout hits in each genre within podcasts. They're not genre-defining series in multiple verticals. And there's not a lot of folks working in fiction, for example, just as one category. I mean, certainly it exists and people are doing amazing work, but I think, it's literally just the beginning of where this is all going.
I also think that's an external perspective. Some people might be hoping for it to crash or burn.
That's fair.
Yeah, I would hope that as publishers and content creators, the focus is on a good listening experience and supporting good listener growth in the space, being mindful of price integrity, not increasing ad load, being mindful exactly what you're saying of what kind of ads you run, and don't kind of take the near-term benefit and sacrifice the long-term gain for having a large audience, let's say. And I'm saying that sitting in a monetization seat. I think there's a lot of value to extract, but I don't think that the race to the bottom is the way to go in terms of just running any and all things that could be conceived as an ad at a lower CPM. I would frankly rather see an empty seat that you preserve for the right kind of ad, if that makes for a better listener experience and grow your audience, and then think kind of as the show starts to grow, okay, what are ways that I can monetize here? And like you were saying, monetize in extensions of your brand. That could be something outside of podcasting even.
If someone comes to you with a brand, a product or service that isn't a fit for you or your audience, you should say no.
Yep.
And the reason you should say no is because they might be with an agency that has another brand that is a fit. And if you perform poorly on that first ad, they're not going to bring you that second advertiser that is a fit. And it's hard to turn down money when you're first starting out, but please turn it down if it's not a fit.
And Ryan, you were actually at the agency before you joined DAX. Can you tell us a bit about that transition and any insights you might have from your background?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting coming from the agency side, just because being connected to the brands from the agency side, you see that there's a lot of passion and that there's a little more of a human element than just this disconnect of being on the the agency, being on the vendor side or the publisher side, where you don't know what the brand is actually trying to evoke. So being on the actual agency side, you're working with a brand more often, and you're able to understand where they're coming from. And if you're able to convey that to the other side, I think you're able to actually allow for the messaging, the brand messaging, what you're actually trying to evoke to the audience to be able to be communicated better.
And we talked about host-read ads. There's obviously traditional advertising units, 30s and 15s, are associated with podcasting. Kelly, you started talking about some of the more integrated custom, solutions. When we were talking early on, you mentioned the project you worked with the film company on creating like companion content, where you're almost creating the environment in which a podcasting can appear. So I thought that was an interesting example. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not even sure what to really describe this, if it's marketing, if it's branded
I
content.
had a hard time describing it just moments ago.
Semantics. But, we worked on this really interesting project that we got to work with the LA Times Studios on. And essentially, Focus Features went to LA Times Studios and said, hey, we've got this film called Greta, sort of a campy thriller. It's a little bit of a tricky one to market. And it's dealing with really intense, stalking and unrequited love and really sort of some disturbing themes coming out of this movie. But for us, the challenge was, how do we create content around this idea that it's not an infomercial? No one wants to listen to a 5-hour commercial, clearly. So what we proposed and what we ended up doing was a 5-part limited series in which each episode we basically explored, key themes from the film. And so we were able to really cast for real stories on both sides of the equation. We spoke with Marcia Clark, who is amazing, and we really did a journalistic take on the material. And the only point to the actual film was at the mid-roll ad, we created a sort of a custom pod that was generated from interviews we did with Chloe Grace Moretz, who is one of the main actors, and Neil Jordan, writer-director. And so it was basically a short interview with each of them talking about sort of what their goals were in the film. But that was the only sort of mention of the movie at all, and the rest of it was just pure content. And it resonated. It got over, I think, 350,000 in the first couple weeks. And for us, it was really exciting because it's essentially a marketing device, but it's also IP that, it sort of tees up a bunch of interesting questions where, a lot of marketing campaigns sort of have limited, there's a beginning, middle, and end to it. And so now with marketers and advertisers getting into this mix, and when something resonates, you have that feed, you have an audience. So what are you going to do with that audience next? It's really interesting.
You mentioned IP, so Tim, one thing I thought was interesting during one of our conversations was everyone knows about like Wondery and creating a podcast and working with LA Times eventually became Dirty John. You were talking about a talent that is now using a podcast to create a book, and just the evolution of how the idea just morphed to what it is today. I think from a creator standpoint, that case study might be pretty interesting.
Sure. So a singer-songwriter named Kathy Heller came to us and said, hey, I want to do a podcast. I tried to become a pop star, but it didn't work out. But I was able to sell my music to film and television, and I'd like to do a podcast where I'm teaching people how to sell their music to film and television. And I was like, that's interesting, but what if you made it for all creative people, not just for musicians? And she's like, oh, that's perfect, because whenever we go to parties, my husband's always like, why are you always trying to talk people out of their jobs? And I'm like, that's it. So the podcast is called Don't Keep Your Day Job. And she just had a book come out this week that you can buy on Apple Books or anywhere you purchase your books. And she also has a podcast called Don't Keep Your Day Job. So it's something worth checking out, and very, very inspirational. If you find yourself stuck in a cubicle and are looking for creative inspiration, check out the podcast and the book.
I'm going to go off the agenda and kind of surprise you guys and go to audience. You have so many creators in the audience. This is a great opportunity to speak to some top people in the podcasting space. We could always come back to the questions we had planned, but to give you guys more of an opportunity to have a conversation, why don't we open up the floor to some questions? If that's okay with you. It's too late now anyway.
Yeah, it sounds good. It's okay with me.
Yes, let's do it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, sorry.
We're just trying to yell too far away. getting like 1 million downloads, but then we're learning that's more like 300,000. We're trying to understand the IAB to certify stuff. What language should we be using, and how should we represent our numbers when talking to advertisers?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. You touched on IAB
Can
v2.
you paraphrase the question for the webcasters at home?
Yeah. So the question is, the gentleman represents a podcast network that had 1 million downloads. He recently learned that it's actually 300,000 according to the new IAB, Internet Advertising Bureau, podcast download guidelines, which are the new stats which were mentioned in an earlier panel, a new way of counting downloads, which folks like Podtrac and Chartable are all participating in, along with 10 other folks, I think. So it turns out counting downloads is really hard, and it's a real bummer for independent creators to feel like, oh, like I thought I was getting 1 million, and now I'm only getting a few 100,000. A few 100,000 is still a lot. It's a nice work, but ultimately, it turns out this is just a really hard problem, because podcasts are totally decentralized. You can listen to a podcast on Apple Podcasts on your phone. You can listen on your Alexa. You can listen on Spotify, Pandora. You can listen on literally dozens of apps on dozens of different devices. We all have to agree on what a download actually means. And so that IAB guideline, which has been out since the end of 2017, so about 2 years, is helping the industry to actually coalesce around what a download actually means. And so that's the numbers that you kind of have to use if you're going to represent to advertisers and stuff. Ultimately, when you're talking about, if you're already selling ad deals and people were happy with the numbers they were seeing before, I think you could argue that you were delivering the value that you were promising, even if the top line download number is different. But that's a hard conversation to have. So I empathize with that, having seen it on the creator side. But
Yeah, I'll add, I agree. I think that if you've got some prior art with an advertiser that's been happy with the numbers and you've got that relationship, then, you're good in that exchange, and that's dependent on that person. But I would say broadly, when dealing with, ad agencies or advertisers that are kind of trying to standardize in terms of podcast buys, they're often requiring in the RFP process and conversations, are you IAB v2 compliant? And so they're going to want that most conservative, most recent measurement standard, which does, it does kind of create a haircut to whatever the original number was. I think it just depends on the conversation you're having, but I'm just seeing more and more of a ask from buyers that you're on V2.
Yeah, just to be clear, it is super conservative, right? So if we all opened up Apple Podcasts in this room on the Wi-Fi and all downloaded the same episode of whatever, Serial or whatever your show is, it would just count as one download. So it's IP address and user agent.
That's right.
And that is super conservative, and it doesn't reflect necessarily the reality of what's happening. But you have to agree, and that's what the guidelines are.
Yeah, and if you want to make sure that you're IAB compliant, you can use Podtrac or Chartable for free. So just go to one of those sites, or both of them if you want to compare numbers. And that way your podcast will be IAB compliant. The other thing to think about when you're talking to advertisers and you want to sell your show, there are different formats that you can do. And a lot of times as creators, we're kind of creative, right? And we come up with ideas and we're like, well, I have this coin collecting podcast where it would be great if I could get one of those gold companies to advertise in my... This American Life does not have any gold companies on their podcast. And so you want to think about the advertisers that are already in podcasting. Which of those that are out there are going to be a good fit for your show instead of trying to come up with new advertisers? Don't create advertisers. Go find the advertisers that you can serve and take advantage of the marketplace that's already been built. Then in addition to that, you want to think about the ad format. The format that we found to be the most effective is the host ad read, where there's a quick shout out after the show open so that the listener knows they're listening to the podcast they want to be listening to. Hey, this episode brought to you by Casper. And then about 15 minutes in, halfway point, wherever there's a natural ad break, or a story break or some kind of lull in the content where it makes sense to interrupt it. If it doesn't, then you want to use a different format. But if there is, having a personal story about the product or service that the host is talking about. And so you want that to be like, hey, I was headed out the door to go to Digital Hollywood. There was this box on my front door. I wasn't thinking. I pulled the box inside. I ripped it open, and this Casper mattress expanded in my living room. And now when I get back from Digital Hollywood, there's a mattress in my living room. I should have taken it in the bedroom. You've heard that ad. The reason you've heard that ad is because it's effective.
I echo the fact that, people often come to me and they say, we'd like this advertiser, we have this type of podcast. And I go back to them often and I say, those guys aren't in the space. So there's actually unrealistic expectations that are being set. And I think it's important for everyone to just, I'm not going to say get on the same page, but I would say it's important for everyone to do their homework so that people can have possibly great synergies with working with each other rather than immediately going into a relationship and saying, if we don't have this advertiser, maybe we shouldn't be working with each other. I don't mean to sound so coarse on that, but.
I agree.
In my previous life, I worked at Fox, and I was in on-air promotion for 10 years. And when I was preparing for this, I listened to The Undercovers, which is one of your shows. And I thought it did a really good job, like telegraphing this, that a traditional commercial was about to start, just by the way it was edited or the announcer was reading it. And I was not surprised to hear a commercial, and I thought it was a well-chosen commercial. So I thought that was a good example, in my opinion, of a traditional format being inserted into podcasting in a way that did not feel, that intrusive. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, that really was born out of the fact that we've heard many podcasts who've had jarring experiences. So you'll listen to a podcast and some of it will have these dynamically inserted spots that were placed and it would have a programmatic fill spot. So these, the content producers wouldn't have control over what spot was being put in there. And then, that comes from a whole bunch of different hosting platforms that it's still a beauty and an art in the making that we have to perfect. But it could be really jarring experiences when all of a sudden you're listening to amazing premium content and all of a sudden it says, hey, Geico or something, So it can really affect the experience, and I think that's something to be very conscious of. And I personally, I'm starting to really get into the audio world of the whole technicality of it. And even something as simple as having a host-read ad and then putting a sound bed underneath it. There have actually been studies that show that if there's a sound bed underneath an ad, and again, this doesn't fit for all, but if there is a sound bed underneath an ad, people are more likely to resonate with whatever is being spoken about.
Sound bed meaning like music underneath?
Yes, sorry, thanks for defining. So, that was born out of the fact that I personally I noticed that more and more it's happening where all of a sudden there's just this really loud, frightening experience almost, and it completely disrupts the flow of this amazing experience. So, thank you for that. I tried on that.
It was a free plug. Other questions from the audience? Gosh, a lot. Front row.
And I can jump in for a sec. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. So tell me if I got this wrong, but what is the kind of threshold for downloads per episode where a host-read ad can be kind of represented by an entity doing ad sales? That sound right? Okay. And the second question was, how performant are comedic ads? Yeah? Okay. So on the first one, I think we might all have different answers. I'll say candidly that it's got two components to it in terms of size. One is how large the show is, right? That makes it meaningful to a buyer. Because if you do a host-read ad, there is work and getting copy from the advertiser. The advertiser is going to talk to the show oftentimes before the ad read happens to make sure they know about the product. There's a lot of exchange. It's a high-touch ad product. So you want to make sure, the buyer wants to make sure that it's of a size that all of that kind of touch-point effort is worth it. And I find that number is usually in like the 25 to 30,000 download per episode range. That'll vary. If you've got, a super niche, valuable audience that's in high demand, maybe that number comes down a little bit, right? I would say, there's a lot of true crime in our space, so that number might be a little bit higher when it comes to true crime, and it's going to vary depending on who you're talking to, but that's roughly kind of a threshold that I see is interesting for buyers. To the second point, I would say if the programming is comedic in nature, the funny ads that kind of toe that line between being respectful but humorous enough that you actually remember the ad perform incredibly well. If you listen to, Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend, his ads are hilarious. And sometimes he comes right up to that line of, maybe being a little too much, but his audience loves it. They remember it. There's been so much growth in the space based on, comedy podcasts that do exactly that. So if it is natural to the show that you're in, then I think it works great. I think if it's a news program that you like bang out a comedy ad and it feels jarring and disjointed, that wouldn't be necessarily so great. But I think they work great in the right context, really, really well, actually.
I'm looking for 10,000 unique downloads US, and I'm on the fence about funny. Like, I like funny, but it needs to be respectful to the advertiser.
I think the point about it, the advertiser having to do all this work, I think it's really important to think about. It's often as a creator, and there's a lot of creators in this room. I also have a podcast with a very small audience. We think we're making great stuff, and of course somebody's going to want to put their ad on our podcast because it's so great. But it is like a ton of work that the advertiser has to do in order to get a host thread actually done. And they have to choose from your show amongst other shows, and it's a real process and a real commitment. And that's why those thresholds, whether it's 10,000 or 25,000, that's why they're there. It's not because they don't care about your show, but because it's going to be a lot of work and they want to make sure that it's a good return on their time.
Okay. I have to describe you when I point to you. So it's like the burgundy sweater, you know who you are.
Apropos of the story you told about the woman musician, how common is it for someone to come in roughly speaking cold and want to actually develop a podcast more or less from scratch based on the fact that she had this particular personal history?
So let me try to repeat the question. How common is it for someone to start from scratch and build an audience?
Well, no, develop a show.
Develop a show. Oh, how common is it for us to develop a show? It really varies on who that person is and what they're bringing to the table. Obviously, somebody who's got a large email list, or some owned and operated media, like a magazine company, or a YouTuber, an influencer. Those are all things that are pretty valuable. There are people in the room that have partnered with YouTubers to launch podcasts that will be launching very, very soon. There are other people in the room that have been dabbling in podcasts and haven't found that audience yet. But there are certain things that you can do to grow your audience. And I always tell people, if you have a podcast and you sign up for PodTrack, which is free to use, and let me know that you signed up for PodTrack, I'm happy to get on the phone with you and spend 15 minutes and tell you all the things that I've learned from Apple Podcasts over the years on what to do to grow your audience.
Just to jump in really quickly, as far as development goes, we get pitched quite a few shows, whether it's talent-driven, whether it's a script, or anything in between. And I would say across the board, there's not one project that's sort of come in that needs zero development. I mean, I think that's part of the process, and also just sort of coming from television where we did quite a bit of that. You have to put the work in. I think the more time you spend developing out your concept and what you want to say and how you want to say it is going to lay the groundwork, for a much more successful series in the long run, as opposed to sort of figuring it out as you go. And I think it's also really difficult when you don't have an audience, or you have an audience in some other medium. I mean, the sell to us all the time was, we've got 80 million views on YouTube, so of course this will be a huge hit on Sci-Fi. And unfortunately, that audience literally never ports over. So I think you have to really think about that carefully. And at the end of the day, you just have to really have something original and as non-derivative as possible to say. And if you don't have that, you really don't, you're starting from a really tough place.
Great. Woman with the gray sweater. Yes.
can speak to the platform situation. It certainly is valuable. Yeah, sorry, the question was like, there's a two-part question, and correct me if I got it wrong. Number one, is there value in being, in ranking on Apple charts or being in the apps? And number two, what are your next steps after you've gotten your show developed, you've been doing it for a year, and you're starting to think about monetizing? I'll speak to the first part just because that's what I know pretty well, and hopefully somebody else can add or chime in for the second part. There is value in being in the apps. The most value is to be at the very top of a chart or to have editorial placement. And it makes a huge difference in downloads, and I'm sure you've seen that. Anyone who's had a show has seen that. When you get into the smaller subcategories, it's a little tough. There's not a ton of people scrolling to like number 175 on the stand-up comedy chart to like find a new show. I'm sure there are some. Well, that's great. That's fantastic. She's top 20. That's fantastic. I'm sure you do get organic listeners that way. But it's just one of many ways that you have to think about how your listeners find your show. The number one way that listeners find shows is word of mouth. The number two way is social media. And social media means that one of their friends shared it, right? So it's really just another way to say word of mouth, but just with technology, right? So platforms and apps are, I think, the number 3 and number 4 way. I don't remember, we did this survey last year, but you really have to think about how you're going to grow your audience. And charts and editorial placement are one way to do that, but it's just one piece of a larger marketing campaign for sure.
Cross promotion too. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cross promotion. So if you can figure out how to get on other podcasts, it's obviously a little tough when you don't have such a budget that you can get there. But if you can figure out some kind of like quid pro quo situation where you can trade, then that would be good too. I mean, there's a lot of people, especially if you could figure out the niche content that your particular story is in, and then if you could try to find other people who are in that content as well, there's just this whole passover.
I think we have time for one more question. To your left, right there. No, you. Yes.
So speaking from a streaming rep firm, we work with agencies, so it could be the traditional
How are
brand.
ads sold was the question, by the way.
Right.
Sorry.
Yep. So there are vendors who work with, and you could call them whatever you want, but there are companies that work with agencies, and on one side, so you'll have a sales team that works with agencies, whether they're traditional brand agencies like these huge WPPs or Omnicoms, or you'll have the direct response type of agencies, which are all performance driven, like Veritone, Warner, Oxford Road, and then on the other side, you'll have people like me in the same company who will be working with the podcasters, holding their hand, making sure that the ads are being placed inside their ads. So there's a bit of a hand-holding process, or it could be automated. So it could be, a type of like a megaphone where you can actually upload your own.
Or Art19.
Sorry, yes, Art19. But yeah.
Well, thank you. You've been a very engaged audience. I'm going to ask one more question to the panelists. Everybody's been asking like a future-facing question, so I'm going to ask a more superficial question, but fun maybe. What's your current podcast obsession? Mine personally is Dolly Parton's America. If you haven't checked it out, it's really good. So, Corey?
Oh, yeah.
And anything else you want the audience to be left remembering?
Oh, goodness. Recent, it's seasonal, but Mobituaries, Mo Rocca's podcast, launched like 2 weeks ago. It's awesome. Yeah, that's a really fun listen. And then otherwise, just ongoing. I love Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend. And Oprah's Super Soul Sunday is an awesome podcast also. Yeah.
I'm very, very focused right now on scripted fiction narrative podcast. I think it's a very, very exciting time to create some IP that you own and then can take that to other places, whether it's television or film or video games or VR.
Couldn't agree more. It's funny, on the way over I was listening to a series that I think I'm late to the game on, but it's called The Truth. The episode I was listening to is Hilly Earth Society, and it's a fiction podcast, but it had a very sort of authentic, real feeling to it, and the episode I listened to was basically based upon a series of voicemails that escalate. I'm really interested just to see where the form is going, and I felt like that was a really kind of creative way into it, so that's a good one.
I'm sorry to say such a common answer, but how I built this with Guy Raz is my morning coffee. I actually don't even drink coffee until I get to work because of how amped up I get from listening to this podcast. And the beauty with Guy Raz is he'll stop, he'll pause the entrepreneur and say, wait, back up. What was that specific detail that you missed that might help the average person figure out what actually drove that person to get there or what helped them? Did your parents give you the money, right? Where did you get that money from? So I love that.
Awesome. My very favorite podcast, and this probably says a lot about me. I don't know if you guys can hear me. There we go. My very favorite podcast says a lot about me because it's like the nerdiest thing in the world. It's called Conversations with Tyler. It is hosted by Tyler Cowen, who's an economist at George Mason University. He interviews other economists as well as like authors like Margaret Atwood and Karl Uwe Knausgaard and all these folks. And it's so intellectually dense. He like researches everyone so crazily before the interview, and it's like kind of like too much at times, but I just like totally love it. It really like tickles my brain. And I've also been listening to a bunch of music podcasts, including Switched on Pop, which I think they're based here in part of Vox. Great show, just breaking apart pop music in a really serious way. If you love music, I feel like there's going to be a lot more great music podcasts. There's such a great medium for breaking down how music gets put together. So I'm super excited to listen to more of those.
Just to jump in very quickly, with music podcasts, we're currently doing a music podcast with Disney Music, and it's called Four Scores. Everyone check it out if you like music. It's a really exciting series where we get to go behind the curtain with basically the most iconic film and TV composers working today, and they're sort of showing us how the sausage gets made, and we've just really, really enjoyed it. It's utterly fascinating, and having access to all that great music has been a real treat.
Well, thanks to everybody watching on the interweb. Thanks for being such an attentive audience. Thanks to the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.